60% of the African population, approximately 400 million youth between the age of 15 to 35 are residing in Africa. And the continent is perceived, or rather is seen, as the new hope of the world. However, this population is also a blessing in disguise because they are facing the raw face of unemployment, and despite of going through education, most of them, majority of this population, is not in formal employment. Ladies and gentlemen, the Global South in the recent years has experienced this young population emerging with a dissenting voice to influence regime change and challenge the leadership of the continent that everything is not right. In the Sahel region, the continent has experienced military coup. Botswana, not Botswana, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, and you can name them. Those countries, we've seen regime change that has been influenced by military coup. And immediately the military come in the street to take over power. The young people come out to hug and celebrate them because there is new glamour, there is new clamor for hope. This is something that has been replicated in other parts of the continent. And in Kenya, for the last 2 months, Kenya has experienced what has been called a civilian coup, when most of these young people took to the streets, the young people asking the president of Kenya, William Ruto, to fix the country or ship out. And immediately the Gen Z protest got its root in Kenya. Other countries tried, Cameroon, Ghana, and Nigeria. But the rulers will then unleash the police with brutality in the streets to suppress that part of the population. But the continent is yearning for renaissance. The continent is looking for change. When Senegal were allowed to go and have what will be called a free and fair election, they produced the youngest president in the continent speaking. But as that comes in hand, the West is here and is unsettling to question, because what the young people are questioning is that these leaders that are aligned towards the West are not really, that relationship is not relating to very tangible policies, or rather very good policies that can help steer the continent to the next level. Professor Shahid Bolsen is emerging and is warning the continent that the West is posturing here as the country supporting interests of the continent through the NGOs and aids, but that is not it. And is asking that Africa, or are they saying that Africa can identify its goal if the day they will accept and be intentional about the independence. In this podcast, I want us to listen to Shahid Bolsen, but after that I will break down the 3 key areas indicating that the West is not honest about fixing Africa. Pan-Africanists have been saying Africa must define itself and it must solve its problems. Let's listen in here.
How important it is to those who are keeping it intact. And I'm talking now about the West's relationship with Africa, because the West's economic relationship with Africa has not fundamentally changed in over 800 years. This is absolutely stunning. If the drastic and rapid changes that can occur and have occurred within the West over just 1 or 2 decades, if that's breathtaking, well, what about the fact that nothing has changed between the West and Africa in basically a millennium? I mean, the relationship was ruthlessly extractive 800 years ago, and it's ruthlessly extractive now. And you can't help but recognize that keeping things this way simply must not only be important to the West, but literally it must be the most important thing to the West. It's so important to them that they have always maintained this status quo no matter what else changes in the world. Wallahi, they're dedicated to the subjugation and the exploitation of Africa more than they're dedicated to anything else. Everything else is allowed to change except for this. This must never change. And it's not difficult to see why. I mean, it's the subjugation and the exploitation of Africa that has enabled the West to impersonate a superior civilization. It's like a con man, you know, a drifter who tries to convince people that he's some sort of an aristocrat or a monarch or something. Well, he needs to have some kind of a display of a monarch's wealth in order to be convincing. And that's been the whole basis for what the West claims about itself being superior. The whole basis has always been that they're materially successful. So, okay, today you have iPhones and technology, you have a high standard of living and so forth. So that means that you must be better. You must be more intelligent. You must be more evolved. You must be more civilized, more advanced than the rest of us. I mean, look how nice their places are. See how much better their stuff is. Well, this is all reliant upon the vicious pillage and plunder of Africa. Without this subjugation, without this exploitation of Africa, Europe and the West would be nothing but crude, emaciated serfs, barely producing enough to survive. Their wealth was primarily derived from theft and plunder, from piracy and slavery, from mass murder and crime. This is just a historical reality. Because of the subjugation of Africa, first through chattel slavery, the extraction of Africa's human resources, and now through the extraction of natural resources, the West has been able to maintain this artificial, unearned status as a so-called civilization. Keeping Africa subject, subordinate, suppressed, and impoverished is an existential need for the West. It's the only way that they can keep up the pretense of their supremacy. Because again, the pretense of their supremacy has never been based upon any actual advancement, any actual sophistication, any actual moral or intellectual development. It has always been based on the violent accumulation of wealth and resources, upon brute power, deceit, and conniving. And Africa, the subjugation of Africa, is the most vital necessity for keeping this con going. I mean, right now, the trade relationship between the West and Africa is that something like 70% of exports to Africa from the West are manufactured goods, and imports from Africa are just the raw materials used to make those manufactured goods. So they're taking from Africa what is needed in order to produce goods that then Africa buys from the West, made with their own raw materials. And the West has done everything possible to try to impede Africa's ability to build its own manufacturing base so that they could potentially use their own raw materials, use their own raw minerals to produce their own goods. I mean, the whole process should be done in-house. It should all be done in Africa. That's what makes sense. You know, you have the materials, you have the minerals, you can make the products. That's how it should be. Rather than giving your raw natural resources to the West, for them to manufacture and refine and process and so on, Africa could do all of those things themselves. I mean, imagine the impact that would have. Where would that leave the West then? Well, they know that. The West knows that. They're acutely aware of their actual total dependence upon Africa. If Africa manufactured, if they used their own resources, their own minerals, their own materials for their own industries, well, the entire economy of the West would collapse. And with the collapse of their economy, their whole so-called civilization would collapse. Africa is the foundation upon which they built their house. So they know this. And like I said, this is why no matter what else changes in the world, no matter how power dynamics shift in the world, the subjugation of Africa has been maintained for over 800 years. There's literally nothing more important to them than this. And this is why there are very powerful factions in the West that want to destroy BRICS, and why they fearmonger about Chinese investment in Africa, and why America specifically is engaged in non-stop interference, covert operations, regime change, regime infiltration projects all across the continent. I mean, look at South Africa, the ANC, either out of naivete or corruption, or naivete that devolved into corruption, or out of coercion, or some combination of all of these factors, the ANC collaborated with neoliberal programs for 30 years. I mean, to one degree or another, for the last 30 years. But as global power dynamics have been shifting, and the creation and the ascendancy of BRICS has been taking place, people have started to have aspirations. And more importantly, they've started to have options. And those options have made their aspirations actually achievable. I'm talking about aspirations of political independence, aspirations of economic sovereignty, aspirations of getting out from under the yoke of the West. That's actually becoming achievable now. So the ANC was facing, and they are facing, severe criticism and opposition. They were being challenged. And they were being challenged by parties that do not accept neoliberalism, neoliberal colonialism, corporate colonization. And the U.S. knew that eventually they were going to lose power. Eventually the ANC was going to face the consequences of capitulation and collaboration, and they were going to be removed and replaced. And if the U.S. didn't do something, then the replacement for the ANC was not going to be an obedient client. Because again, South Africa has the option now not to be an obedient client of the West. I mean, as long as there were no options, then it wasn't that risky for America. Even if the ANC lost popularity, no matter who replaced them, they would have no choice but to capitulate to neoliberalism because there was no options. But there are options now. So you have the United States then backing the so-called Democratic Alliance, the DA, which is an overtly neoliberal, Western-aligned, elitist political party of colonizer collaborators. So the unpopularity and the opposition to the ANC opened a space for the DA to move into the government in the last election. So now you have this so-called GNU, the Government of National Unity, which is nothing but a neoliberalism light and a neoliberalism hardcore. It's a coalition of one party that was aligned with the West, the ANC, aligned with the West out of coercion or naivete or corruption, but which could have potentially been influenced by anti-neoliberal popular sentiment if given a chance. Now they've joined together with a party that is intensely committed to colonization, intensely committed to neoliberalism. I mean, they want to privatize everything. They want everything to be sold off to the private sector. They want to hollow out the government completely. And you need this radical neoliberal colonizer faction to be there because as the new options have emerged, you've now had radical anti-neoliberal positions being advocated and becoming viable. I mean, you're actually having calls for the nationalization of industries rather than the privatization of state enterprises. Well, the West can't have that. So they need something like the DA, the Democratic Alliance, to move in to try to avert the threat of South Africa actually becoming politically independent and economically sovereign. You know, they call it the GNU, but the N shouldn't stand for national. It's the government of neoliberal unity. It's a coalition united against the people of South Africa, in my opinion, in service to the interests of the elite private sector of South Africa and to the global Western private sector. The DA is a racist, Zionist, anti-BRICS, pro-Western colonizer political party, funded at least in part by the National Endowment for Democracy in the United States, which is nothing but a wing of the CIA, whose sole mission is to advance American interests. So in South Africa, this was a regime infiltration project that was undertaken to actually avert regime change in South Africa, organic regime change. Because look, you can nationalize the mining sector in South Africa, you can. You can nationalize the banking sector, you can nationalize the Reserve Bank. You can do all of these things and everyone knows it. It's not some kind of a mystery that these types of measures would be immensely empowering for South Africa. These aren't measures that we don't know whether they're useful and beneficial or not. Obviously they are, and tremendously so. And that's precisely why these types of policies, these types of measures have to be subverted. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous for anyone in South Africa today to advocate neoliberal policies when we have in front of our eyes the catastrophic failure of those policies. I mean, nearly half the population is unemployed, over half the population among the youth. 75% of South Africans earn just the equivalent of $350 a month or less. In fact, roughly half of the population earn only $75 a month. And you're still going to advocate for the policies that got you here? No, obviously, if you nationalize, it's better for you. Obviously. I mean, empower the government with those abundant resources instead of letting foreign companies seize those profits and transfer them out of the country. I mean, if those revenues are going to the state, then the government will have the resources they need to better address the needs of the society. They can invest in SMEs, they can provide education, skills training, and so on, fund R&D. I mean, it's a no-brainer. But you're scared of what the West will do. They tell you that if you nationalize, then there will be massive capital flight, investors will run away, and so on. Well, think about that for a second. They're trying to scare you with consequences that they themselves will be imposing. They're warning you that if you do something that is in your country's best interest, they will punish you. This is very different from telling you that the policy in and of itself is actually bad. They're telling you that they will make it a bad policy because of what they will do to you if you implement it. You understand? These people are threatening you, and then you're supposed to trust their advice? The advice of these neoliberal predators? You're supposed to listen to them and trust their advice when they are blatantly telling you that they will punish you if you do something to try to make things better, to try to change things? I mean, they couldn't make it more obvious, their malice. They couldn't make their malice more obvious. They couldn't make it any more obvious how against your best interests they are. How much they put their own private interests above the interests of their country. They're openly identifying themselves to you as your enemy. Do you understand me? I mean, they're not saying that nationalization doesn't work. They're not saying that it isn't beneficial. They're saying that they will do everything in their power to make sure it doesn't work. They're saying that they will sabotage nationalization for their own sake, for the sake of their own profit interests. And still you let this type of people have a say in policy discourse? Well, that's humiliating. They hold you in contempt and they don't even hide it. I'm telling you, everyone knows what should be done in a country like South Africa, what kind of economic policies they should implement. And it's the same thing that many global South countries should do. Everyone knows the obvious economic benefits of these types of policies. And everyone knows that the only reason that you don't implement these policies is because parasitic, predatory, Western colonizing private sector powers will try to punish you if you do. I mean, for instance, the nationalization of key sectors in South Africa or in any other country, such as mining, such as energy and finance. This is essential to try to break the stranglehold of foreign capital on your country and to ensure that the country's resources are actually used for the benefit of the people and for the benefit of the domestic economy. Land reform. The question of land reform in South Africa is critical. This is a critical issue. There should be a comprehensive land reform program in South Africa that prioritizes the redistribution of land to the historically disadvantaged. This is basic, and it's incredibly obvious. And once you've boosted the state's resources through nationalization, there should be a comprehensive social welfare system that provides for the basic needs of all citizens, including healthcare, education, and housing. This is, again, obvious. And finally, the government, of course, needs to pursue a policy of industrialization and job creation, a policy that prioritizes the development of the domestic economy. And like I said before, prioritizes the manufacturing of goods from their own raw materials, from their own raw minerals and their resources, rather than the export of those minerals to Western companies for them to use in their manufacturing. Honestly, none of this requires any particular brilliance to understand. These aren't radical policies, but they're only made to seem radical, and they're treated as radical because everyone is living in fear of private sector tyrants who completely control the discourse.
I like and I really concur with his statement. Allow me to take a minute and draw from what he's saying in South Africa. When South Africa was heading to this election, South Africa had joined BRICS. And the West, which is now likely the United States of America, it was not supporting BRICS because BRICS was to de-dollarize the world. So after the election, it was very historic to see ANC joining government with DA. The Democratic Alliance is perceived as pro-US. And now, they have now joined government, and some of the policies that have been churned borders privatization of many companies that now going to the hands of individuals. And they are now perceiving, and of course now DA was supposed to be the opposition party in South Africa, joined government, and now ANC, which was known all along from the centuries then, that it was pro-Africa, Pan-Africanist, is now joining with an outfit that subscribed to the Western agenda. And through that hybrid government known as Government of National Unity, now US and the West is getting their way in South Africa. And I draw that parallel with what happened in this country. In this country, there was an attempt of regime change by a civilian coup when the young people rose against the administration and said, enough is enough. The giant opposition party, the ODM party, was rashly rushed to government and joined what has been touted as a broad-based government. And those that support that outrightly say we were trying to salvage the government. But in real sense, it's not a salvage. This is a purely Western agenda. Because now as we talk, William Ruto and Raila Odinga, if William Ruto subscribed to the US agenda, they will outrightly subscribe. Even the ODM, they will face resistance, less resistance from the ODM wing. The US and the Western powers have always vouched for opposition. Even if in the US, can you ever tell us whether there will a day will come when Republican and Democrats will form one government? I don't know. Maybe people from the US can tell us. But in Africa, you can see an attempt to realign. Any sort of regime change that is being influenced, organic regime change, is not supported by anyone. And even when you get to the ballot, and the reason why the young people, I started by saying, the reason why the young people are restless is because even the organic transition is never successful. There will be an attempt to infiltrate. And so I want to say my three bases, or rather my three observations why Africa can only succeed in its economic success, economic prosperity, when they observe these three. And these three are the challenges. The West, as the professor is saying, is coming in Africa to collect resources. And after they collect resources, they take our natural resources, they produce refined goods, which is sold back in the continent, and through that they are getting finances. And then that is why the financial supremacy comes. That money is given back to the continent in form of loans and debts, and those debts come with conditions. And the US that money is churned towards brittle institutions of World Bank and IMF. The World Bank will come and roll up a program in the continent, in Africa, of electrification program, of supporting some needy children or supporting widows here and there. But in real sense, Europe depends in Africa. The goods, the raw materials are here. The imports from Africa is raw material, and they export in the continent refined goods. But why I also agree is the multinational companies they're setting up in the continent are leading in tax evasion. I had analyzed here. When they come in the continent, if they mean well for the continent, why are they leading in tax evasion? And the tax they're paying in the continent, they're repaying in their home countries. And the other day in Rwanda, Kagame was asking that why don't Africa be part of the value chain? So that if it is a trick, if it's something that, if it is a raw material used to produce, why should it not be? Why should that company be set up and Africa be owned to produce and do value addition? The other two here is the West impedes organic change at war times and will stop at nothing to ensure that democratic principles are eroded. Look what has happened in South Africa. DA and ANC, and Professor has spoken about it. Look at the Kenyan context. the ODM and the UDA, and now you don't know whether it is UDA in government or it's ODM in government or UDA in opposition. In fact, someone says the country Kenya have ended in the middle of nowhere. And through that, so long as the democratic principles of putting government on check is eroded, then every regime will stop at nothing. An attempt to do regime change, even organic regime change, will be infiltrated by the West. And lastly, the debts given in the continent by the Europe are not really, they don't obey the laws of the land. In Kenya, you are supposed to only lend us money on specific projects. But when you do an analysis here, you realize that there are loans that are being given to the country in disregard of the law of the sovereign of the country. And this has given this government's opportunity to take that loan and now start merrymaking. Start going to parties, partying with that money. Because instead of giving us loan specifically for a specific project, we've allowed the continent freedom to come to Europe, seek loans, come here, and not follow up on them. And that is why the country's debt ceiling is at 12 trillion. And even if you ask, can you show us whom are we paying, you cannot get that explanation. So ladies and gentlemen, I end this podcast by saying Africa is the foundation upon which Europe is built. And if Africa would be able to get its path to identity and exploit its potential, then the Europe economy will collapse. Thank you.